people in 89 and a reception at the college after his Summer of the Gods had won the Pulitzer Prize in History. And he has just been an encouragement and source of information and inspiration for some of the things that we have tried to do with the Scopes festivities. The details, or a few of the details, are in the program. And instead of dragging this out, I want to say I'm glad to have you back. Come talk to us.
Tom is nothing less than amazing. This would not be happening without him and without the support. I started coming here before Richard Cornelius. He picked up this as a topic, and then Richard Cornelius, and you remember him, was absolutely instrumental. And then it's just amazing. So I do thank you. I took his advice this morning, and I had a wonderful. I'll tell you, if you want a treat, about 2 blocks away this morning, and I hope they maybe still are. They were selling some of the best sweet corn I ever had. I went back and put the pot on. They cleaned it a stick this morning. I'll tell you. I taught for 20 years and chaired the history department at the University of Georgia, and we may beat you at football, but we can't beat you at sweet corn. I'll put on my John Scopes glasses for you. Now, I sort of pulled together these slides at the last minute. I was going to just offer the people this morning, but I figured after lunch, after wherever you ate, you're probably going to go to sleep. So I thought I'd give you some images to look at as you nod off. Tom asked me to speak about scopes in society, how scopes interrelate to society. So I will try to do that. And to do that, I'm going to talk sort of about 2 parts of the talk. I'll talk about how society impacted the Scopes tribe. And on that, I'll extend and mixed up was a good introduction. And the second half about Scopes impact in society, I hope will be a good impact, good introduction to what you're getting tomorrow. And I'll try to be a bridge between the 2 days. Now this is a picture, of course, from the day. And we'll get to why Dayton's at the center of the storm by the end of the talk. But of course, this picture was a block or so over with Robinson's drugstore. And when the trial began, they were quite proud that it all began there. So they put up a sign trying to lure people in to get Simeon sodas, as they call them, inside. The legendary trial from 1925 that you're all hearing about while you're here, of John Scopes for teaching the theory of human evolution in the public school here, remains the best known of America, battle in America's so-called culture wars. And as such, it has different meanings. Now, if you look back at the time, one was captured by this. During the trial, they were selling this brochure that Town Boosters created, and you all know the basic story of the trial. I won't repeat that here, though I'll happily take questions on it. It was why make no places. And it tells us one thing about why they view the connection to society. If you read the brochure, basically they're saying that Dayton is every place. Dayton is everywhere. Dayton's nothing special about Dayton. Dayton could be here, it could be anywhere, it could be any place. And that these are controversies that arise from the nature of the American way. So why Dayton of all places? Next line is, why not Dayton? It's America. Now, there's another view that has lived with us after the trial. And this is a still from a promo for the movie Inherit the Wind, which presents what I call the legend of Scopes, a myth of the Scopes trial that many people believe. I had an embarrassing call last week from a reporter of a very prominent newspaper, and they wanted some quotes about the trial. And they said they were up to it because they prepared to write about the trial for this newspaper by watching Inherit the Wind 2 times. And I said, well, I hope you know nothing and it's right. And it's about other things. It's not about the Scopes trial. And I went on at probably too high a level for this gentleman, answering questions at rather length and debunking the movie, but telling that the movie does capture part of the social impact of an event that occurred in Dayton, but then is created into a myth. And he was almost out of time, and to show that nothing I had said sunk through. His last question to me, I said, I don't have much time, but I just want you to confirm. Whatever else you said about the movie, they got the encounter of Brian and Nero just about right? And I just rolled my eyes and let it go. Because that is part of the legend. And it's captured in this still, where near the beginning of the movie, the play begins with Dick York there, teaching evolution, human evolution in school, in a Dayton school before he was arrested. That's one of the legends. The real John Scopes, this is on his, sitting at the house he lived at down here, a couple blocks away. It's still there. But I asked Randy questions about stuff like that. Randy's the expert on minutia about Dayton. I try to know things about the trial. He knows things about Dayton. We have a very friendly division of expertise. This, of course, was a still picture taken at the time of the trial where Scopes and all the local people reenacted for the TV cameras and movie cameras. And you can see all the locals, Scopes in the middle, and all the locals that were supposedly there. And I think it's probably correct. I think it's probably a good reenactment in F.E. Robinson's drugstore for the beginning. So you have the facts, you have the trial, and you have the myth. And that's all part of the social impact. But to understand the Scopes trial, you've got to go earlier. The social ties of the Scopes trial, you've got to go earlier than that. And we went way back. I ain't going to go as far back as he went. But then, I teach Georgia, and he's from Oxford, Cambridge, I'm a state school product. Now, to understand how it impacts American society and how it grew out of American society, how in one way it's true, Dayton is every place. But in another way, the movie tried to other Dayton. And that's why people here didn't like it. They tried to make Dayton look peculiar, unique. Which is what H.L. Mencken was trying to do with his articles. That this was not a normal place. This was a breeding ground of controversy. In fact, instead of using the title Evolving Conflict, they would have suggested, and there's some truth to it too, it should be Creating Conflict, if you want to go from that creation and evolution. But it really didn't begin with the indictment of John Scopes for allegedly teaching evolution on May 7, 1925, when, with his consent, Dayton City solicitor, shown here, in the back there, indicted Scopes for violating the New City statute, making it a crime punishable by up to $500 fine for any public school and I'm quoting here, this is about the whole statute, it's a very short statute. Nothing like the great big beautiful bill. This was a very little bill. to teach any theory that denies the story of divine creation as man is taught in the Bible and to teach instead that man descended from the lower order of animals, period. And as I pointed out, it was defined as a gross misdemeanor, punishable by $100 to $500 fine. Now, all those involved, shown here in this picture, viewed this as a friendly test case to test this controversial, and was controversial, new law, and a ploy to promote Dayton, which worked. Here we are. Here we are. It's still promoting Dayton, thanks to help from people like Tom, who's a little more honest about it than some of Radley and some of the others. And the story did not even begin in March 21, 1925, when Austin Peay signed the bill into law, and this is a picture of him doing so. For all intents and purposes, the story began 4 years earlier, when populist orator and politician William Jennings Bryan, a self-proclaimed Christian fundamentalist but the term didn't have quite the hard edge that it developed later, launched what he called his crusade against evolution that sought to ban teaching about human evolution in public schools. A charismatic fixture on American politics for nearly 3 decades, Bryan had burst onto the national stage in 1896, when he won the nomination for president for both the Democratic Party and the Populist People's Party on the platform of promising bimetallism to address and redress an ongoing economic recession, the so-called Panic of 1893, which was still going on in 1896. After very narrowly losing that election, aside from being Secretary of State in the 1910s, he became a public speaker, giving hundreds of paid lectures annually, addressing sort of a populist mix of social and religious topics, sort of reform politics tied to evangelical religion. Anti-evolution represented simply the final of his messages, the topics of discussion. He talked about it before, as Nick mentioned, but it was minor for a long time, until after World War I. And he preached these messages for reform to the American people, his people. Now, Bryan gave hundreds of addresses during the early 1920s, including one in Nashville, Tennessee, on January 24, 1925, that led directly to the introduction of the passage of the Tennessee Anti-Evolution Law response to trial. So in many ways, it was his law and his trial. Why it was appropriate is here. So Bryan, as I said, was a populist politician and anti-evolution crusader, and as such, he was a product of his time. I want to talk about social roles. And that time was traumatic, profoundly traumatic and disorientating to many people. We're talking about the early 1920s, which later became known as the Roaring 20s. And roaring, by nature, roaring is traumatic. Now, why was it dramatic? Well, one was the aftermath of World War I, as Nick mentioned. Estimated number of people who died in World War I from 1914 to 1918 ranged from 15 to 25 million people. Now, there never was a war like it. This includes both military personnel and civilians. Now, Bryan himself, he used to talk about it a lot. Just as a representative, the numbers always jumped around for Bryan. But in a 1923 article, he put the number that died at 30 million. The total number of military deaths is about 9 to 12 million, with Allied losses about 6 million. Total number of civilians is put between 6 and 13 million, with Turkey having the most due to the mass extermination of Armenians at that time. Now the trauma didn't end there. The war was followed by the Spanish flu, the deadliest epidemic in world history, which swept the world in 1918, killing an estimated 50 million people. 1/5 of the world's population was infected. Within months, it had killed more people than any other illness in history, including 2/3 of a million of people in the United States. In 1 year, the average life expectancy in the United States dropped by 12 years. The war also unleashed the largest refugee crisis in world history, with some 20 million people, especially in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, driven from their homes with the collapse of multi-ethnic empires, such as the Ottoman Empire or the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, all of which had accommodated various nationalities, but now they were replaced with small ethnic states, which all practiced ethnic cleansing. They wanted their state, whether it was Croatia or Hungary or whatever, to be just Turkey, just to be their people, and they sent the other people away. Now, many of these people, of course, headed to the United States, which responded with the 1924 Immigration Act, the first statutory limits ever placed on immigration generally by the United States. The Act established a national origins quota based on the 1890 census. Bryan was a big supporter of this restriction to protect labor, as he said. This meant that only 2% of the total number of people of any particular nationality could enter the United States. That is, as were represented in the United States 30 years earlier, which largely limited to Western Europeans to preserve the nation's homogeneity. Now, this was all part of of America's, quote, return to normalcy. That was the campaign platform. The winning campaign slogan of Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge and the Republicans in 1920. Harding campaigned, as this button says, on the pledge to put America first. He was the first one to coin that term, or his campaign team, which meant limiting immigration, raising tariffs, and reestablishing order. As his running mate, he picked Massachusetts Governor Calvin Coolidge, who was best known for having broken the 1919 Boston police strike, and as an enthusiastic supporter of immigration restrictions. Of course, let's speak louder now. Of course, World War I also brought the communists to power, or the Bolsheviks in Russia, leading to the Red Scare in America, and fostered labor unrest in the United States, causing militant strikes and even more militant countermeasures. Can I reach the back there? I don't have Brian's voice, but I'll try my best. Now, add to that the great migration that was going on at that time of blacks from the South to the Midwest and California, actually recruited by groups like the Ford Motor Company for jobs, good jobs, in northern urban areas. Before, blacks mostly lived in the American South with agriculture. This depleted the agricultural workforce in the South. And it brought jazz and the jazz age to northern cities. Both of them disruptive. It was disruptive for both the North with the jazz age and maybe enriching, but disrupting, discombobulating to many, and to the South. Prohibition, strongly supported by Bryan. He claimed it as one of his 4 constitutional amendments. And new laws outlawing recreation and drugs came as countermeasures to reestablish social norms. Now, I could go on and on and on, but that was the milieu. This anti-evolution law did not stand out as something particularly different. This was the milieu of the day. You get my point. Americans were looking for stability. Restrictions on on education were very much part of this. During the war years, the state has passed laws to states all over the country, from California to Maine, to restrict the teaching of German and restrict teaching of communism and to mandate flag salutes and recite prayers and Pledge of Allegiances in class. Schools and colleges across America had dismissed teachers for opposing the war effort or the draft. Some of this had been done locally before, but with the rise of state compulsory education, which had not existed for high schools before that in America, now your children are compelled to go to public high schools. Well, that raised the tenor. And it made people think, well, we should control what's going on if our children are compelled to go and we are compelled to pay with our tax money. So this accelerated in the early 20s with state laws requiring in class Bible reading, forbidding the employment of teachers who were deemed radical, pacifist, communist, or socialist, mandating the teaching of capitalism, and prohibiting teaching, well, as one state put it, their law said, prohibited teaching that ours is an inferior form of government. The anti-evolution crusade simply added laws restricting the teaching of evolution. It was the sort of things that were being done. Those restrictions had shifting, but wide, some of them, different ones, different people, strong social support. It was the social basis, anti-evolution crusade. Populism has been described by historians as a movement that offers simple, popular solutions for real or perceived social or economic problems. In the 1890s, as I've already mentioned, Bryan jumped on that bandwagon with his call for bimetallism, which, if you don't know, is the coinage of silver at 16 to 1 with gold, as presented as his answer to the Panic of 1893, which was the most serious economic depression in U.S. history prior to the 1930s. Bryan wrote it to his nomination for president in 1896 by embracing bimetallism. You shall not crucify mankind on a cross of gold, he told cheering delegates at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. It won him the nomination and almost the presidency. This phrasing played on Bryan's appeal to Christian America, a simple slogan that captured the popular mind, and in doing so, made an abstract economic idea, making a larger money supply to deal with the contracting recession, and made it a popular mass cause. Now, it turned out the discovery, when he lost, the discovery of gold in Alaska and the Klondike in Australia proved a readier remedy for these economic problems of 1890s than bimetallism. But at the time, there were a lot of folks saying Bryan was right. America needed to expand its money supply from gold because the amount of gold had not really increased since the California gold rush. Well, he continued out of office to promote reform, popular reform. This is a banner, this is a picture from the time, and it captures really where he stood. And it's social. It comes out of being social. It wasn't this odd little thing that Inherit the Wind makes it sound like. Shall the people rule? The people want to change. The dawn of permanent prosperity. And look at the people marching with Bryan in all walks of life. That was the image of Bryan at the time. Well, by the 1920s, he increasingly spoke on, and he was giving, as I think I said before, he was giving on the average at this time of his life, because this was his main source of income, an average of 200 paid public lectures a year, traveling around on train. And then there were the associated book sales, because we know all his speeches, because he gave stumps. He didn't give stumps. He was not an extemporaneous speaker. He prepared, carefully crafted, and his speeches, then he repeated those same speeches multiple times, and he would sell them. He put out booklets, and you could buy the speech. He increasingly turned to popular attacks on teaching evolution in public schools, and it captured two things. You can see how he moved from issue to issue, and people recognize that. He would run mainly on, this one has on bimetallism, torch, and pacifism. He promoted peace treaties between countries to arbitrate disputes. Prohibition, he claimed 4 constitutional amendments, the most of anybody other than James Madison. That was the direct election of senators, the income tax. He's a big supporter of the income tax, promoted it. Women's suffrage, it became an important, and he claimed he put it over the top. And by the way, for this crowd, what was the final state to adopt the...
Tennessee.
Tennessee, absolutely. And Brian claimed credit for that. What one am I missing? Oh, prohibition, of course. One of the other choices there. And now, this one, anti-evolutionism. And that, he had more than causes than this, but these are some of the big ones. Child labor, he almost got that as a constitutional amendment. That was very close, and he pushed that. Now he turned on teaching of evolution in public schools and churches. So you can only understand it if you see it in context of all this other stuff that was happening. In a string of speeches, Brian, and some of the names, after World War I, back to God, bad names, in his image, the Bible and its enemies, and menace of Darwinism, Brian increasingly placed the blame on evolution and evolutionary teaching. Now, it had two main thrusts, which was similar to what Nick covered this morning, but I'll put it in the context not of 1800s in England, but at the time in the cartoon. One is, he would argue, that it leads people away from belief in God, agnosticism and atheism. And there you have the Pied Piper labeled as science, falsely so called. They always maintained that evolution was not good science, it was falsely so called. Darwinian hypothesis of evolution, leading to disbelief in God and the Bible. This other one, though, as was pointed out this morning, was the social consequences. Certainly, lack of belief in God is a social consequence. But the other one he pitched was war, labor unrest, exploitation of labor. That is, science falsely so-called has opened up the bottle of Darwinism, and now comes the spirit of lawlessness, and Mike Main's right. Those were the images. They were well captured in this, one of his final speeches that he put together, later speeches, The Menace of Darwinism. This was the cover page selling it. But you can read through these things and pull out, he ratchets up this as an issue. What is it that whittles away the Word of God and destroys its vitality? Brian Spelset wrote, I venture to assert that it is the unproven hypothesis of evolution is the root cause of nearly all the dissensions in the churches. Another time he wrote, and these were all in the early 20s, during the war, he had long criticized scientists for creating chemical weapons and the other machinery of war that made World War I so much more deadly than any prior conflict. And so he concluded, to destroy the faith of Christians and to lay the foundations for the bloodiest war in history would seem enough to condemn Darwinism. Now, that was his complete. Social consequences and religious consequences. And he was pulling for popular reform. A culminating example of it, shortly before he went to Nashville, Tennessee, was a speech he gave to a National Convention of Seventh-day Adventists in Mountain View, California, on September 25, 1924, where, after this long litany, he concluded all the ills from which America suffers can be traced back to the teaching of evolution. Earlier he said similar things about liquor in his call for prohibition. He'd say similar things. He thought we'd never have a war again if women had a right to vote. He argued that. Income tax would create greater fairness and get rid of a lot of social problems. Limits on child labor. It was all tied together. So when it came to Dayton, and that's where I'll leave the Scopes trial and go to the second half of my talk in the next 15 minutes. When it came to Dayton, one of the evangelists, one of the very popular American evangelists from, I think from Mississippi, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, T.T. Martin, set up a booth on the main street in Dayton, and he named it the Anti-Evolution League, and he was selling his own material, just as Brian did, but his two books that he was selling was The Conflict, which was The Conflict Over Creation, but Hell and the High School, focusing right in on the social implications of teaching evolution. Well, this is where the Scopes trial comes from. Now, to transition, if that was dividing people in the way that Nick was talking about and the way Brian launched, and indeed I did happen to see where I'm staying, they had this book. And I think it's fairly apt. It's a biography of William Jennings. It's still in his wrapper because I didn't buy it. They just let me borrow it. William Jennings Bryan, a difference maker. That's true. He made a difference. The person that beat him, William McKinley, did make a difference too. A lot of politicians and a lot of presidents don't really make a difference. He was a difference maker. Now, and that's what we see from there. Now, during the Scopes trial in July of 1925, the Boston Globe in an editorial wrote, "Liberals, radicals, and conservatives alike are alike in this respect. Few of them seem to learn from the biblical admonition in Galatians. If you bite and devour one another, watch out that you are not consumed by one another." And that's what is captured by the sense that was there, that the Scopes trial didn't resolve anything. Nobody at the time thought Scopes was the winner. Even if you watch Inherit the Wind, you'll see otherwise. Nobody at the time really thought Darrow and the defense were the losers. The controversy had just been ratcheted up by two great speakers, Bryant and Darrow, who made their arguments and forced the nation to come to, really divided the nation over this issue. Now, of course, as you all know, Scopes was convicted. And the law was upheld as constitutional at the trial level and then at the court level. And once it was upheld by the Tennessee Supreme Court, well, sort of like happened after the Dobbs decision a couple years ago, when as soon as the Supreme Court made the Dobbs decision, what was that, 2022, there was an explosion of anti-evolution restrictions around the country. What, 34 states now have abortion restrictions? The same thing happened when the Scopes law, Tennessee anti-evolution law, was upheld in the Scopes conviction. Scopes was convicted. There was an explosion of anti-evolution lawmaking in America. Here's a cartoon about Arkansas. And it passed a very similar law. But it was more local school districts, but it was other states, local school districts. And as a result of that, evolution virtually disappeared from American classrooms. At least if we can tell by looking at the textbooks, and I've looked at all the textbooks from the Scopes era to 1960 and beyond, that were multiple editions, that came out multiple times. I didn't, it might be little local ones. But in all of them, evolution virtually disappeared. Some of them might still use the phrase development, but most of them talked about dissecting frogs or other matters. They didn't talk about evolution because it had been restricted so many places. It's like happening today with abortion. Now that's a social impact of the trial and its conclusion. That remained true for a long time. It remained true basically until the late 1950s, early 1960s before it had an impact. But in the late 1950s, when there was the Sputnik that happened, and American politicians thought America was falling behind the Russians in science and technology, the Congress passed the American Defense Education Act, I think that was its name, which poured money into writing new science textbooks. Before that, textbooks were mostly written by textbook writers. That was their job. They were professionals, they weren't academics. After this, the BSCS textbooks, but similar with the physics textbooks. I used both of them as a kid in the 60s. They wrote new textbooks that they hired top academic scientists. And that meant evolution, which was by then a very different, it was after the neo-Darwinian synthesis, a neo-Darwinian evolution had become the core concept in biology and became a core concept in these new science textbooks. Well, with science ascendant, and remember this is the era of the polio vaccination, this is shortly after the atomic bomb, the power of the military, the new jet airplanes, people are now flying in Delta jets, it's also their 100th anniversary, Delta, I found that out on my flight out. I guess they're of the same age as the Scopes trial. Still flying to Atlanta. All those things, jet airplanes, all those things. Science, or you remember the graduate movie, The Future's in Plastics. There's a science development. Science was ascendant, and with it, these textbooks were widely adopted. Some would say pushed down people's throats because they resulted in a lot of opposition. Yet, it was tied to the Supreme Court becoming a liberal Warren Court with changing the rules on religion and education. They extended the prohibition against establishment clause to the states, which had never done so before. They did that theoretically in the late 40s, but it led to banning school prayer. Some of you may be old enough like me to remember when the school prayer was banned and what a reaction that caused. Banning religious instruction, not instruction about religion, but people never understood the difference. Banning religious instruction in public schools. And finally, in 1968, striking down Arkansas's anti-evolution statute, which was similar to Tennessee's. And that led to a social reaction. It led to book burnings in some places, in Arizona, book burnings of the new textbooks, a variety of responses, but probably, I believe, the most significant timed right with this. In 1961, Henry Morris and a colleague, Whitcomb, published a book called Genesis Flood. Now, if you remember, you all remember enough about the Scopes trial, that Bryan and the law simply argued for excluding the teaching of evolution in Tennessee public schools. It did not call for certain creationist instruction. Now, part of the reason there wasn't any scientific-sounding creationist alternative. Most people, as Nick pointed out, were evolutionists of some sort, though I would argue in 1925, most people were either theistic evolutionists, most scientists were either theistic evolutionists or neo-Lamarckian evolutionists, neither of which have the same perceived conflict with Christianity than old-fashioned Darwinism of the day. But Darwinism at that time was not very strong, I don't think. What it was, evolution was strong, but different forms of it. Now, that changed when Henry Morris and Whitcomb came out with their book, Genesis Flood, which offered scientific, he was a hydraulics engineer at Virginia Tech. This book, and then he founded the Creation Research Institute to promote these ideas that the Old Testament was literally true. That the world was created relatively recently, within the last 10,000 years, on 6 literal days. And that Adam and Eve were created, on the 6th day, along with all land animals. And Adam named the animals. And he would come up with scientific evidence to support this. But his purpose, like Bryan, was not really scientific, which agrees with what Nick said this morning. It's captured in this particular book by Morris, Creation, the cutting edge. If you read that at the beginning, the cutting edge of evangelism. What he cared about was that evolution, just like Bryan, he believed that evolution was the root cause of a lot of bad things. This particular quote lists some.
the same sort of things that Brian had picked out in the 1920s. Because in some ways, the 60s were as roaring as the 1920s. You have your own image of what the 60s were like. You have your own, I've given you an image of what the 20s were like. A lot of that overlap. There's been a period of less quietude in between. And Morris believed that a lot of it could be blamed on belief in evolution, that it underlined. And he worried about those social consequences, but like Brian, he was profoundly bothered that he thought that belief in evolution, any type of evolution, ultimately undermined one's faith, which was Brian's argument too. In fact, Brian once described theistic evolution as an antidote, such as ether applied by a dentist so they can extract your religious faith. And that was similar to Morris's view. Now his theory, and I know I want to get done so there's plenty of time for questions, Morris carried that banner, but now he's passed on to a person who had been one of his employees, I think that's fair. Ken Ham. Ken Ham worked with Morris, originally from, I think, New Zealand, went to school at the University of Queensland in Australia. But I think he was born in New Zealand. Or was it the other way around? But he went to school in Queensland. And he ran a creation institute over there that was connected officially and distributed Morris's materials from the Institute of Creation Research, and then eventually came to the United States and built his own. Some of you, if you came down from the north for this event, may have stopped at the Creation Museum just south of Cincinnati, and this is the Ark. And his concerns are much the same. He builds very much on Morris's scientific work. He believes that evolution undermines religious beliefs, but he also thinks those have social consequences. And I love this cartoon. He founded, when he got to America, he founded what was originally sort of a splinter group, Answers in Genesis, that eventually became even bigger than the Institute of Creation Research, more of a social impact. And you see this from the Institute of Creation Research, 2004, Answers in Genesis. And so there's evolution, the problem. And notice evolution is bombarding the foundation of creation, the Word of God. While the creationists in the tower are just trying to shoot down some of the balloons that rise up. The consequences, racism or abortion or family breakup, pornography. So evolution is undermining the foundation. Christianity is only trying to deal with the consequences. Now, if you go to the Creation Museum, you'll see dioramas capturing, and I think it's very instructive because for anyone, because Ken Ham's done a beautiful job of creating what the concerns and what people see. Here is Adam naming the animals. The Peaceable Kingdom by John Hicks and the Quakers is nothing compared to this. And Adam, that's the point, Adam knew the animals. He was greater than any later scientist. He knew the animals, as Linnaeus or Buffon or others would later try to know. But this museum also talks about the consequences. This is a banner picture, I think I took this one, of the consequences of not believing in God's Word and creation. And you've got the Twin Towers blowing up, and you've got people taking drugs, and you've got destruction and problems. Because before the fall, as this exhibit shows, even the dinosaurs were vegetarians. And I presume they didn't destroy the crops. They must have eaten so they'd still live because, as it says here,
what did dinosaurs eat?
Vegetables. That's what the sign says, if you can read it. I can try to close it in on here. Because there was no death before the fall. And it's captured in this picture I took of Ken Ham with one of his dioramas of a baby, of a young girl in these times, in the early days, before the fall, living amongst the dinosaurs. Safety. But if you don't follow that view, if you don't, this is this is from Christianity Today. If you don't, and this is a magazine, if you don't matter to God, you don't matter to anyone. In a society, we are reaping the consequences of a unquestioned acceptance of belief in evolution every day. It diminishes the worth and it diminishes the worth and something of those. Oh, we no longer believe we are made in the image of God. And so it shows this young man aiming a gun at you. It gets your attention. The other person we have to think about, and I've got to stop, was Philip Johnson in the intelligent design movement. The intelligent design movement makes a slightly different argument. And what they attack is the methodological practice that science and material entities subject to physical laws account for everything in nature. Whether you call it materialism or naturalism, such a philosophy in practice excludes God from science and science classrooms. As Phil Johnson would always say, Darwinism may be the best naturalistic explanation for the origin of species, but still be wrong. If public schools can't teach creation science, because it's too religious, the creation science of Ken Ham and Henry Morris, if they can't ban teaching evolution, well, then what you do, at least teach the controversy over evolution. And he wrote the language that Rick Santorum got in national legislation in 2001, was passed by the Senate as part of George W. Bush's No Child Left Behind Act, and later became part of the Law's Conference Report, that says that encourage teachers to make distinctions between philosophical materialism and authentic science, and include unanswered questions and unsolved problems in their presentations of the origin of life and living things. It led to Alabama adopting a textbook disclaimer that still is posted on the inside front of every Alabama text, a biology textbook that says, in part, I'm editing that so I can read it. The theory of evolution by natural selection is a controversial theory that is included in this textbook. Instructional material associated with controversy should be approached with an open mind, studied carefully, and critically considered. Add to this, more recently, the academic freedom bills that have been introduced around the country and passed by Tennessee. And what those bills do is they follow this same approach. And what they call for is allowing schools to let students, the Tennessee law states that protects and encourages the critical study of some controversial scientific theories as evolution, the chemical origins of life, global warming, and human cloning. Vaccination has been added to these bills by other people. Under the law, local school districts must assist and may not hinder teachers from helping students to understand and critique existing scientific theories. The third prong of this is opt-out. And that was just upheld by the Supreme Court a couple of weeks ago in the Mahoff versus Taylor case. That was over a different issue. That was over LGBT-friendly readers. But the way I read the decision, it applies to parents in public schools have the right to have their students opt out of controversial issues, especially if their objections are religious, which is true about evolutionary teaching. Well, that basically is the social, what I view as the social roots and the social branches of Scopes. If you want to say that this place is shown in this picture is the trunk of the tree. I've tried to follow some of the branches going forward and some of the roots leading into it. And it still matters because religion still matters and science still matters to people in America. They both matter. Take polls, they both have majority support in America. And so we still have, we're all brought back together, we still have, and now we have the statues of both men. When I came here for the 75th, those statues weren't there, but now we have both men standing outside. You can take your pick of who you want to take a picture with, and in that sense, as Scopes predicted, Dayton and his event and the Scopes trial remains the center of the storm. So with that, I do want to thank Tom for pulling this together and being here for the 100th anniversary of the Scopes trial. Recently, when I came to the 75th, I came from speaking in Kansas. And I just came from speaking in University of Kansas again, and I told them that I'd been there for the 75th, I was back here for the 100th, and I've already put down in my calendar, in my electronic calendar for, what was that, 2050 would it be? For the 100 and, well, I guess I said 125th, so that would be, where's my math?
Yeah, 2050.
50, yeah. I put down on my calendar. So I'm ready to come back. If you're here to host it, and Rick's here to make it work and make my computer work, I'll be back. Thank you.
So I know that in other countries they don't have strict separation of church and state ideas the way we do, and I wonder if you could speak to how the United States situation may have influenced the way the evolution-creation controversy has developed in our country.
Our country. Well, his question was, if you didn't hear it, he's trying to compare us to other countries. And and how much the laws. Now, as we've seen with the decision I just mentioned, there, with that decision, that's one of a series of decisions where remember, we did not have separation of church and state unless it was in a state constitution. We did not have that in the states before 1947. Because the First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. Well, Tennessee made one. That was the intent. In 47, the court raised that barrier and extended the barrier of separation of church and state to the states and therefore public school districts. Now, many people at the time thought that was too high. Justice Thomas doesn't think it should be there at all. And we're seeing, things change. Politics change. We're seeing it lowered. I think this is an example of it. This isn't the only example of it. There's increasing use of school vouchers. It's not, but it did make a change. How did it make America different? When that barrier was high, it pushed a lot of students into homeschooling and into private schools, Christian schools. The numbers were never huge, but the there were a variety of pitches for private schools. I was living in Athens, Georgia, here. But you'd hear them anywhere you went. There were a variety of pitches, but one of the pitches was, we can teach Christians. And Henry Morris's books by the Institute of Christian Research, the textbooks they produced, even though they were prohibited from public schools, were widely used in private schools. Widely. They would be the dominant book. And they were widely used in homeschooling. Now, there are other issues. I'm not saying that's the only issue that motivated a movement to parochial schools, Christian schools, and also to homeschooling. But it was an issue. So that would play out here where it wouldn't in the same way in other places because they did not have separation of church and state in the way it is here. Queensland, Australia mandated equal time. So did British Columbia for a while. They don't have the strict separation of church and state that we had. I don't think we have strict separation of church and state anymore. But we did for a while. We appeared to have for a while. And so I think that now there's an issue of Well, opting out would be an example. The Alabama disclaimers are still there, so far as I know. And I think we'll see, with the lowering of whatever you call the strict wall of separation, you'll see, and the rise of charter schools, which are often public, big issue about that in Oklahoma this past year, and it'll come back up since it was not a very decisive decision. It was a 4-4 tie. Charter schools are sort of public schools, and in Maine there's been a ruling that the amount of money you get to take to any private school could also go to a Christian school, as the Supreme Court. So I think you're going to see the difference less, but in certainly states that don't have that separation of church and state, for example, a year or two ago, Turkey banned the teaching of evolution in public high schools. And they don't have a separation of church. It's an Islamic country. And most Islamic countries ban the teaching, so far as I know, everyone I've been to bans the teaching of evolution in public high schools. Morocco does, Malaysia does, Indonesia does, the ones that I know about. I think it's pretty uniform, except the Islamic countries that were part of the former Soviet Union. And this is common in African countries. So yeah, it has channeled it somewhat different, more toward homeschooling and parochial schools. But the concerns are similar. Yes, sir.
I know nowadays a lot of people have a very simplistic idea of what evolution is. Most of them not really the origin or any of the many books since then have actually explained. It's not something that can be explained or understood by anyone in a few minutes. People think they understand the mechanism, but they don't. Do you think that Brian and Morris and some of those others you mentioned, even the ones today who are advocating legislation against teaching evolution, understand what they're talking about, or even understand how it works?
Well, I mean, the question was, do the people who oppose evolutionary teaching understand how the dominant scientific theory of evolution operates? Is that fair enough?
Yeah, the mechanism of
The mechanism.
They haven't read like Dawkins' books, Blind Watchmaker, things like that.
Well, some of them have. I certainly, one of the people I put up there, Philip Johnson, certainly read Dawkins' books and knew him well. I believe. I talked to him. I think Morris probably understood, so far as I know. Brian probably not. Brian was more, remember he had a lot of causes, so he probably had a popularized version. But back then, evolution, back then, 1925, when we were in here, the modern neo-Darwinian synthesis was simply a twinkle in the eye of what was Fisher's first name? Ronald Fisher, who was an Englishman. He was still working out the neo-Darwinian synthesis, and he didn't finish the job, but he certainly got it going. And what the modern neo-Darwinian synthesis is, it's a synthesis of Mendelian genetics with Darwinian selection. And it's evolved from the neo-Darwinian synthesis, so that now it's even a much more rich theory. But back then, that didn't exist, and so it was very tough to know evolution theory. I would say that most evolutionists back then, scientific heads, were either Neo-Lamarckian, like Ernst Mayr was back then, or Osborne, who had the American Museum of Natural History, referred to, or Cope, or Hayek, or all the great, or had a theistic evolution, which was very strong. Most of the I would say all, but to be safe, I'll say most, of the expert witnesses brought here by the defense, who were scientists and who were not scientists, who were theologians, believed in theistic evolution, like who was the head of the Human Genome Project? Francis Collins. He says he believes in theistic evolution. But that's what I would think most of the ones who were brought here believed in. That'd be fine.
I think Darrow understood.
Now we move to Clarence Darrow. Darrow was Lamarckian, believed in Lamarckian evolution. He believed that people pull themselves up to their bootstraps, and he had a pretty. knew Lamarckian evolution, but they didn't know the mechanisms of the combination of genetics and neo-Darwinian synthesis. So I think that Morris probably did. Bill Johnson certainly did. I think Ken Ham has a working knowledge of how it operates. That'd be my guess. As for most people, no, I don't think most people in America, regardless of which side they take, because you look at a poll and a very high percentage of Americans, maybe 50, somebody here probably knows the latest statistic better, believe that evolution is involved with the production of, they don't believe they believe in an evolutionary view. I think many of them would be theistic evolutionists. And there's a large number that believe in special creationism. I don't think either of them understand. I don't think most creationists understand the true theory of intelligent design or the true theory of creationism. Because if you look at creationism, the modern theory of the creation scientists, there's a whole lot of evolution going on, but it's microevolution to produce all the variety from the few that could squeeze on the ark. But there's a lot of evolution going on in there. And they would differ on, was there just one finch and it turned into all the finches, or was there one bird that produced all the birds? I mean, so I don't think people understand it, but I think in the same way, what other issues? Most people don't really understand the science or the opposition on either side, climate change or the vaccines or any of the other topics. But it's a good point. That's my answer. Any other questions? Do we have to answer some more? Or have I tired everyone out and you love those? Do they have moon pies downstairs? Moon pies and bottles of Coca-Cola? Any other question? Yes, sir. This will be the last one.
Okay. I seem to recall a poll that was done in Louisiana of biology, public school teachers, a number of decades ago, where they found that the majority of them were not believers in evolution, but believers in creationism. Do you remember that poll, or do you have any idea of what the belief among public school teachers of biology is regarding evolution?
I do not remember that poll, but if it was as you described, the question was that a couple decades ago, a poll was taken in of biology teachers in Louisiana, public school biology teachers, I presume, or all biology teachers, secondary, that would include the religious schools, and that most did not believe in evolution and preferred some version of creationism. And it wouldn't surprise me at all. I saw polls from that era, because that's when I was writing books and about it, and I was following it really closely. And yeah, that if there was such a poll, that result wouldn't surprise me. There has always been. I would have thought it would be more like the polls I remember are more like a third. And there's a wonderful expert on this who I was with earlier this year, who teaches at University of Arkansas, and he follows all these things really closely. And I believe he publishes the Biology Teacher magazine or something like that. And yeah, I think you'd find that at least a third of biology teachers in some states would support creationism. So that was your question. Yeah, I think that would be true. At least it was true back then. The polls suggest that the number of people accepting evolution in the American people has been going up slowly, but much of that is some sort of that God uses evolution as his means of creation, which was widely, by the way, was widely accepted before Brian and the anti-evolution crusade, before the rise of the World's Christian Fundamentalist Organization and William Bell Riley, which was all sort of about the same time as World War I. If you go back before that, the leading book of the early articulation of the fundamentalist position was a series of pamphlets published by the Stewart brothers, who had the money of the Union Oil Company, called The Fundamentals. And there was not the fundamentalist, that name was coined in the late 1910s. The Fundamentals came out a series of 1912 to maybe 1914. And many of the authors, like James Orr, of the articles in that, proto-fundamentalists, evangelicals to the core, believed in theistic evolution. Oh, there you go. Oh, we have one more?
A very quick comment. Lest the audience leave thinking that modern-day biology teachers are disproportionate creationists, we happen to have someone here who has conducted studies on modern biology teachers and could actually tell us a little bit about the situation not being quite as dire as it sounds like.
But wasn't some states a third back in 20 years ago?
About 20 years ago, a national representative sample of our public high school biology teachers in 2019, 10.5% of them agreed with the creation option from the standard Gallup question.
There you go. And I don't know if those earlier polls were all biology teachers, high school, but I do remember some that in some states it was around a third. You could be right on Louisiana. He said 10% now for public biology teachers. And we were both talking, it has changed. We were talking about about 2000. So thank you for that addition. And thank you, and thank you.
This wraps up today's session. Hope to see you back tomorrow morning